Hello, viewers of OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa program. Today I'm joined by Sebastien Primony from Paris. Primony is author of the book See Africa with the Eyes of the Future, and he is also desk of the International Schiller Institute. And thank you very much for joining me, Mr. Primony, and it is my pleasure to host you.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I want to say hello, good morning, or good evening to all the Ethiopian people. Yes, I'm a member of the Africa desk of the Schiller Institute, which is an international institute fighting since the 80s to have a reorganization of the financial system and to implement worldwide large infrastructural projects based on a win-win cooperation and end geopolitics and wars and cold wars. And today it's more urgent than ever. And also I have wrote this book, See Africa with the Eyes of the Future, because since I was a kid, you know, every time we were hearing about Africa, it's always famine, it was always war, genocide, and so on and so forth. So I decided to write this book.
Why you give this title, See Africa with the Eyes of the Future?
Yes, because as I was saying, when we are talking about Africa, most of the time in Europe, it's about wars, famine, starvation, you know, problems and problems and problems. So I decided to imagine what will be Africa in the next 50 years when Africa will be totally developed, industrialized, with bridge, railroad, infrastructures, a healthcare system for everybody, for each student, education for everybody, water for everybody. Right now you have the International Water Forum in Dakar, Senegal. And we know that more than half of the African people have no access to water. So this book is not only to imagine the future of Africa, but it's to also to give a recipe to create this new world with full development for the continent.
Thank you very much. And we will talk more about this book in the future. And let me come to the main discussion of our today's program. And some arguments are coming out that some African countries are still fail to fight against the neocolonialism. And why do you think this is so? And how long this will continue, Mr. Primony?
First, because we have to admit that we are living in a very aggressive financial empire, which you call neocolonialism. And this neocolonialism is organized around a financial oligarchy, which is based in the city of London and Wall Street. This is not new, and the fight against neocolonialism can be traced back to the birth of the United States of America. The United States of America declared its independence from the British Empire in 1776. And the problem that arose then remained the same today. And I think it is necessary for all the people who are listening to us to reread the writings of Alexander Hamilton, because he wrote 3 reports that are still useful to free ourselves and the countries from neocolonialism. First, there was a report on national banking, then a report on manufactures and industry, and finally, a report on public credit. And these reports form a whole to put an end to Adam Smith's imperialist theory of free trade and so-called invisible hand. Thus, each state must have the right to have a national banking system and a public credit policy that allow it to develop its manufactures and industry. And this was the whole point of colonialism at the time. The colony were only exporters of raw materials, as is still the case today for many African countries. We see in Ethiopia, for example, a dynamic that goes in this direction with the development of railroad, large infrastructure projects, such as the Renaissance Dam and industrial zone. This is exactly what this financial oligarchy does not want to see, the real economic development of country. For it is this development that allows true sovereignty, and true sovereignty that allows real physical development. And needless to say that Alexander Hamilton was killed, you know, for this idea, and we are still today teaching in all the universities of the world the British imperialist system of economy of Adam Smith. So if we want to win this fight against neocolonialism. I have an advice. You go in all the library, all the university, you take all the books of Adam Smith, you throw it to the garbage and replace them by the books of Alexander Hamilton, and it will be a good beginning to end neocolonialism.
And do you think Africa is effectively using its indigenous wisdom to fix the problems of the continent?
When we look at the situation of Africa today, and if we compare it with China, for example, and the China strategy, we can say that the answer is no, unfortunately. Remember that China was among the poorest countries in the world in the 70s, and now today has become the leading economic power of the world. It is the first nation of the world to have eradicated extreme poverty in the world, with more than 850 million people having emerged from extreme poverty in the last 10 years. And I think this is the challenge for Africa today. As the Chinese president said himself, he is developing a socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it works because it takes into account the whole history, multi-century history of the country. I'm not saying that socialism is the model for Africa, but we need a development model with African characteristics. Don't remember that Africa is a cradle of humanity. Donc, one of the most important reference for me is the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, who showed, especially through the example of Egypt, but it is also the case of Ethiopia, that Africa was able to develop scientific, technological, astronomical, agricultural knowledge that transformed humanity. And in Europe, for example, we often speak of the Greek roots of our civilization, but we must not forget that most of the Greek scholars were trained in Africa and particularly in Egypt. So we must be optimistic. There are many initiatives today in the Pan-African world to make an African Renaissance, whether it is the study of the real history of pre-colonial Africa, the pride of tradition, knowledge, and skill. So everything is here in our hands now to succeed, to achieve finally a real renaissance in Africa with indigenous wisdom.
And as you know, the past generation have done an enormous role in strengthening the continent, especially creating Pan-Africanism. And people like Julius Nyerere, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Marcus Garvey, Jomo Kenyatta, and even others have played a significant role, as you know. And my question is therefore, what the current generation should do to sustain their legacy of these people?
Read, and read. You know, you have to read all these people. First of all, that's a priority. For example, a friend of mine, which is Amzad Boukari Yaraba, who discovered Pan-Africanism when he was in Accra, in Ghana, in the 90s, wrote a book which is called Africa Unites, a history of Pan-Africanism. It was published in 2014, but unfortunately, the book is not yet translated, available in English. So if you find someone or university to translate it, it will be very useful to teach real history of Pan-Africanism to the English-speaking students. And he wrote a lot of books about Kwame Nkrumah, Walter Rodney, Marcus Garvey, all the people you have mentioned. And for the people who are listening to us, he wrote a paper in English that you can find on internet, which is called Pan-African Rising in Harlem, Accra, and Dar es Salaam, Connecting Places, Expanding Struggles. So all these people have to be read. And of course, we have today to revive the spirit of Pan-Africanism and the leaders of the decolonization period. Leaders like Lumumba, Modibo Keita, Sankara, and others are the real patriots. And that's why they have been killed also. So I think today a revival of the Pan-Africanist movement is in progress in Africa. With what we see, for example, I was in Mali last year with people there. So they were studying, you know, the spirit of Modibo Keita, who was the first president. And he was one of the most important Pan-Africanists at this time. So I think all this movement, particularly in the young generation, first have to read Sankara, read Nyerere, read all these people to be inspired to do a new wave of progress for the African continent. And I think the spirit is already there, and it's a good news for Africa.
And the Agenda 2063 of the African Union aims to end all wars and violent conflicts on the continent, and silencing the gun is also there. But the question is, do you think this silencing the guns is practically being implemented in the continent?
In this sense, you're right. The Agenda 2063, which I fully support in terms of this project of infrastructure, is the way to achieve this goal. You have a lot of examples. For example, let me quote some of them. First, the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network, for example, development plan, to connect Cairo to the Cape Town and Djibouti to Dakar, and in cooperation with the Trans-African Highway, which is in the Agenda 2063. This project of development, also the project concerning Ethiopia is a LAPSET, what we call the LAPSET project, which is a Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, which is also very important to connect Port Lamu in Kenya to Djibouti through the development of the railroad between Isiolo, Moyale, and then to reach the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa. So you have a lot of projects. There is also a project which is very important, which I call Sulaya Amani, which means the face of peace, which is a project that I'm working on with friends in the Democratic Republic of Congo to connect all the lakes of the Great Lakes region to each other to develop the Eastern Congo, which has become hell on earth. You know, the situation there with more than 6 million deaths in the region since the 90s. And there is also another project that we are defending with the Schiller Institute, which is the Transaqua project, for which our institute have been working for more than 30 years to revitalize the Lake Chad, where there is no infrastructure at all. And also the situation there is very, very chaotic with extreme poverty and its consequence, which is terrorism all around the place. So in short, with all these projects, and it is only a few of them that I mentioned, but the solution exists, and you have the solution in this Agenda 2063. So we must support this development project, but we have also to beware of the trap of the free trade policy like the ACTA, for example, which wants, as we have in Europe, to implement a neoliberal policy, the law of the strongest and all against all. But I think when all these projects will be realized, I'm sure that the weapons will be silenced and will be replaced by smiles and fraternity between the African people.
Great, and you have mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area, and let me just forward this question, which is directly related to it. And many Africans hope that effective implementation of these African Continental Free Trade Area will help the continent to become economically self-dependent. And do you share this claim? Do you think these African Continental Free Trade Area will be successfully implemented in the continent?
Not at all. So for me, the Continental Free Trade Area, you know, which cover all aspects of trade, goods, services, intellectual property, investment, infrastructure, and it will become, you know, after the World Trade Organization, the largest free market zone in the world with 1.2 billion people and expected 2.5 billion of GDP. So for me, and I agree with the CADTM, which is the Action Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt. And for them, this agreement could be, I quote, among the worst wave of liberalization and free trade underway in progress. I totally agree with that. So even if the defenders of this agreement are trying to win over opinions by talking about Pan-Africanism, nothing less, and are praising with this agreement the priority given to intra-continental trade, which would increase, according to them, by 53%. But I think for me, the Africa horizon is not the same. And I want to quote one of my friends, which is a Senegalese economist, which is named Ndongo Sambasila. And he said, the proponents of this agreement are putting the free trade cart before the horse. And the horse are industrialization, I mentioned it, development of productive capacity, development of Pan-African infrastructures, road, maritime, ports, rail, air, and so on and so forth. So I am totally agree with what he's saying. And I think a much better example for Africa than this ACTA can be modeled on the Eurasian Economic Union, you know, which is not the same as the European Union. For example, here in Europe, with the European Union, we create a supranational state with an independent banking system like the ECB, the European Central Bank, which is therefore independent from the states and over which even France and the other states have no rights at all. So the policy is the policy of the market, the policy of free trade policy, and then chaos. So contrary, within the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union, each country keeps its own economic, political, military sovereignty, but can, in specific cases, enter in partnership, bilateral, multilateral, on different kind of projects. So I think it is therefore not a supranational entity that decides. So this is a great danger of the African continental free trade area, which can impose a neoliberal supranational entity imposing free trade, and it would mean for Africa no change at all.
As you know, Africa has an abundant natural resources, but paradoxically, the continent has been suffering from economic challenges. And how do you think the continent should utilize its natural resources so as to curb these all economic problems?
Sovereignty and sovereignty, that's the key word to understand. So the natural resources are African resources. So African has the right to use it, to transform it, to sell it, and work with who we want. So I think it is very important. So African countries must have the full control over their resources in order to raise the standard of living of their population. And if we take the case of Ethiopia, for example, and Kenya, African states must develop their own manufacturing industry to transform their raw materials locally. An example which is good is South Africa, for example, has recently opened its own made in South Africa car production industry with the help of China and with the development locally of subcontractor of the pieces for the production of cars. And I think this is the future of Africa, manufacturing, industry, transformation of raw materials by sovereignty and the end of neocolonialism.
Many argue that, especially politicians argue that African internal conflict is often open doors for external interferences. And do you share this claim? And how should Africa, close its door for such external interferences and solve its internal problems?
For me, it's not that the conflict in Africa allow external intervention, but it is external intervention that create the conflict in Africa. That's the truth. That's not the other way. So the neoliberal system of plundering the resources of the African continent can only survive in a context of permanent war. That's the game of the oligarchy, permanent war to take the resources. And we have to understand that. We have to be clear on that. And if you take, for example, Jean Ziegler, which is very famous in Africa, he wrote a book already in the 70s, a book called Taking Over Africa. And he was already explaining very well that this imperialist policy, and he was talking about Africa as an open-air extermination camp. He was right, and things have changed little today. So the policies of the IMF, the World Bank, the Washington Consensus have been deliberately put in place to prevent the development of the African continent. And I advise you, for example, to read the work of Joseph Primony, who was from Cameroon. He wrote a book about money, slavery, and the monetary repression on Africa. And this book was already published in the 80s. And he showed clearly the policy of what he called himself the instant misery fund, the IMF, instant misery fund, and how this IMF policy will totally destroy the economy of Africa. Everything is in this book, and the book of Ziegler, already in the 90s. So of course, this external intervention by this neoliberal policy of the imperialist system, that's it that create conflict in Africa, not the other way around.
How should the continent, Africa, and the continental and also regional bodies such as AU, IGAD, ECOWAS is also there, should come together to solve economic problem of the continent, in your opinion, Mr. Primony?
You know, our institute, the International Schiller Institute, is proposing a new approach, not only for Africa, but for the whole world. We have launched a major initiative where leading citizens from all around the world, including medical professionals, farmers, musicians, scientists, students, community activists, civil rights leaders, and others, which have all endorsed a call that we have published in October 2020 and initiated by Helga Zepp-Larouche, which is the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, to create what she called the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposite, to address specifically the COVID pandemics. And now the pandemics, which is coupled with an extreme famine crisis. So the initiator of this project have emphasized the importance of reviving the non-violent tradition of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, all these people who were able to work together even if they were not agree on everything, but to stop this kind of problem that face humanity. And in this Committee for the Coincidence of Opposite, the Schiller Institute have proposed to stop and control the COVID-19 pandemic, that we need to have a modern health system in each country of the world. So we cannot stop a pandemic if you have people who have no water, no hospital, nothing. It's not possible. So we need to bring all the people together, all the country together to build this modern health system in each country of the world. And then when we are facing this kind of crisis, like the COVID-19 crisis, we are ready to face it. And I want also to answer to your question on climate change, because we have first to admit that man will never succeed in stopping the climate from changing. You know, the climate have always changed, and it will always change. So where we see deserts today, for example, there were forests before, and where you see forests today, maybe there was a desert before. So thus goes the life of our beautiful planet. So we will not succeed to stopping the climate from changing. It's very important. And I want to warn Africans against what we call here the green colonialism. You know, a book has been published in French recently, which is very, very interesting, which is called The Invention of Green Colonialism to End the Myth of the African Eden. And it is very, very interesting and very against the murderous madness, you know, of the very responsible organizations that are UNESCO, the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and particularly also the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So if we listen to these people, these liberal and radical environmentalists, Africa will be a paradise with beautiful landscape and animals, and man a parasite who would like to destroy everything while developing. So do not agree at all with this theory. So man and nature can and must live in harmony. And in this book, it's very funny, the author show how you have this so-called environmentalists, you know, so-called ecologists, who leave Brussels by plane. You know, they take the plane, they arrive in Addis Ababa, so they stay in luxury hotels. Then they take their SUV, you know, to visit a so-called natural park, and particularly is quoting the park of Siemen, you know, in the north of Ethiopia. And you have these people coming by plane, you know, in luxury hotel, taking their SUV to go to the north of Ethiopia. And they arrive there and say that it is the Ethiopians who are destroying the environment. even if people have nothing there. So it's quite funny. And they say, you Ethiopians are killing the walia ibex, these animals. So you have to stop to develop. So it's kind of a joke, and this same environmentalist today wants to forbid Africa to use its fossil combustible fuels or to develop civil nuclear energy. So I think we have to be very careful about this so-called green colonialism used by the climate change, ideology.
As you know, the Africa we want is peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Africa. And as also indicated in your book, the title of your book is, I think it is an optimism is observed in the title of the book. See Africa with the eyes of the future. I've seen optimism in this title, and what are the ways towards a new paradigm of prosperous and democratic Africa?
Yeah. For me, it's the education of the young generation. So that is the most important things today if you want to have a prosperous and democratic Africa. So today we have all the technological tools, to make a real renaissance in Africa. The young generation can have access via the social network, via the various Pan-African television channels, to other narrative, on their own history and on the methods of the enemy that keep them in poverty. So I think the dynamic initiated by China, for example, with the One Belt, One Road initiative for win-win paradigm mutual development, the Sino-African Cooperation Forum, for example, the 2063 agenda, all this goes in the right direction. All the BRICS, also the cooperation between Brazil, China, Russia, India, and South Africa. All these go in the right direction to have this prosperous and democratic Africa. And I will add that the policy, once again, of some African countries, and particularly Ethiopia, for real development, real physical development of their economy, are likely to accelerate the implementation of this new paradigm. So this is a good news for Africa, even if the road is still long. I think some countries, like Ethiopia, have started to move in the right direction.
Well, finally, if you have any message to my audience, you are welcome.
Yes, I will say to the audience what we are saying right now with the Schiller Institute, which is not an easy thing to say, because we are at the crossroad, we can say. Because either the world will plunge again into a new Cold War, a real war, or we will be able to reorganize the whole international financial and monetary system, which is totally in bankruptcy today. So if we look at the situation, considering what I was saying, that half of the population in sub-Saharan African country did not have well-balanced and sufficient nourishment even before the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis. And now you have the food price, which is rising dramatically. Even the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, have warned for months now that a famine of biblical proportion threatened to kill up to 300,000 people per day, and that it is possible today. So we are in a very dangerous situation. The world is under the immediate existential threat of generalized warfare and economic destruction. So it's very important to understand that what we need, what we are proposing with our Schiller Institute, is we go back to the spirit that we have in Europe, which is the spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia. It was in 1648, and it was the treaty which ended the religious warfare. And so this Peace of Westphalia is our reference point today, because it was established on the benefit, the honor, and the advantage of the other, and the oblivion, amnesty, and pardon of all that had been committed before. So don't think with the past, and as I say in my book, see with the eyes of the future. So we need a financial reorganization in which all the countries of the world participate, a new international conference to reorganize all the financial system. And this is my final word. So I want to thank you for your your invitation, for your attention, and thank you very much.
Mr. Sebastien Primony, Desk of International, Chilean Institute, and the author of See Africa with the Eyes of the Future. Thank you very much for your insight, and we appreciate.
Thank you.
Dear viewers of OBN Horn of Africa, this is all about our discussion for this edition. Till next edition, goodbye.